I mean, 20 years now. It's 20 years since that glorious day. I have to say, and I'm not entirely sure about you two, but I have to say that it remains one of the days of my life. It remains one of the most glorious events that I have attended, let alone been on the stage of. And it's very difficult to imagine that it's been 20 years. I mean, it's just, I don't know, flown by probably. But that day remains, I think, and it should be, etched in not only our memories, but in modern British history. Because until recently, and probably until this day, I'm not entirely sure, it was one of the very biggest.
The biggest.
Yeah, without doubt.
I don't think that's questioned.
Demonstrations that Britain has ever seen. And obviously it was tied to a cause. And that cause was to prevent the oncoming war on Iraq, which obviously happened, and we still have an Iraq, ravaged in flames, and unfortunately at a situation which we back then, 20 years ago, we spoke, all of us, as well as many of our colleagues and friends and the such, warned that would happen. How did we manage, Kate? How did we manage? CND, Stop the War, and MAB. How did we manage to bring 2 million people together?
Well, that's the incredible question, Anas. But you're absolutely right. We did it. And looking back on those days, it wasn't just the day itself, but it was the years around it. I'm sure you, like us, we did so many hundreds of public meetings up and down the country. And there was just an incredible groundswell of public opinion against the idea of going to war on Iraq. And it wasn't just that we created that. I think there was a popular mood. It was really quite extraordinary, because as I said at the time, most people didn't know where Iraq was. They didn't know any Iraqis, but nevertheless, they were determined to try and prevent that war. And it was quite remarkable, linked, of course, to the whole question of morality in public life. We were being taken to war on a tissue of lies, and people really rebelled against that. And I think that played a big role in building that big surge of public opinion against the war.
Well, it certainly did. The issue of feeling that Tony Blair was really listening only to the opinions of the American administration of the time, George Bush, and not to the British people, did really infuriate a lot of people. Of course, the movement against the Iraq War was global, but it was particularly sharp in Britain because British troops, British armed forces were going to be directly involved, whereas German and French, for example, were not. So I think that sort of drove this. This was a war of choice, a war that wasn't needed, a war where the case had not been made, a war where the security of the British people was not threatened at all by Iraq, despite some of the ludicrous claims that were made. So I think all that drove this tremendous feeling. But I still think it could have not come together in the way that it did if we hadn't built a unified movement. It would have been quite easy to have ended up with a sort of far left movement against the war, a sort of pacifist movement against the war, a Muslim-rooted movement against the war, all doing their different things and not really cooperating. And I think bringing it all together, which was exemplified by the three organisations involved, Muslim Association of Britain, CND and Stop the War, was in itself an achievement. And because you had all those bits together, you could reach beyond them. I mean, one of the stories that I remember about that day is someone, obviously I was at the head of the march, I couldn't see the whole march, but after it had been going for about an hour or so, saying there was this mass of people, all the length of Piccadilly, but with almost no banners amongst them. Now, if you're on the organised left or the trade union movement,
you're going to have your
banners. And there were plenty of banners there, but there were also the ordinary people who had no association with a political or a trade union or a religious group or anything, all there. And that is something that has never happened on that scale, certainly, before or since. I mean, we still hold demonstrations against war and for nuclear disarmament and so on, solidarity with Palestine. But those are mainly activists that are now turning out, and even the biggest demonstrations against austerity, organised by the trade unions, that they reach perhaps beyond the activists to an extent, but nothing like the extent of the anti-war movement.
I think it's true because I mean, being on stage that particular day, I remember I had a 6-7 month old child at that time.
There were so many families on that demonstration, Anna.
That's
so
the
many
thing.
pushchairs.
There were absolutely, and that was the mark. I mean, beyond the number, which in itself is obviously quite staggering, but the kind of diversity of everything. The diversity, as you put it, the organisers and their members, for instance, but beyond that, the families, the ages, the colours, the cultures that were brought. The fact that you rightly point out that maybe members of MAB or members of CND or members of Stop the War would carry their own posters and banners having their logos, but how many brought their own?
Oh, so many.
The teacups,
and so creative.
The pictures, the rainbows, the flowers, all sorts. And that to me was something that really put this on a scale that is totally different to anything else.
If I had to think of 2 words to describe that day and the best things about the day, it was unity and diversity, brought together.
And the sheer immensity, because I remember, when you're involved in it, you don't really have perhaps as much time to sort of enjoy it or reflect on it. While you're actually on the day, you're worrying about who's going to be speaking next and 100 other sort of issues that are coming up. What are we going to do with Jesse Jackson and so on and so forth? But it wasn't until the demonstration, the rally had finished. There were still people coming in the park, but about half an hour after it finished, Lindsay German, the convener of Stop the War, then and now, and I went off to meet George Galloway and some friends of his in a restaurant on the Edgware Road. So we walked up there. We stayed there for about an hour. Then we had to go somewhere else for a drink with the stewards to say thank you to them. And this is about now effectively about 2 hours after the rally had ended, and still Edgware Road was packed with coaches going home. And everywhere as we walked, it's quite a long walk across London to Holborn to our next appointment, there were placards stuck in the railings and everywhere. And that's when I just thought, goodness, we really have done something here. This has just been immense beyond anyone's...
If you recall, the starting point or the gathering point to start the march...
There were 2.
There were 2. There were actually. One was in Embankment.
That's right, yeah.
And one was Gooch Street, was it? Or,
that's right. Was it
yes,
Mallet Street?
Mallet Street, probably, where the universities are. And they then joined together around Piccadilly Circus.
That was the most tremendous.
That was incredible because it's like 2 immense waves of human beings carrying all sorts of...
And the joy from both marches on coming together and then going down Piccadilly.
And I recall being on stage. We've now started. We've now begun. And I was one of the chairs. You were one of the chairs, Andrew. And I recall after something like 20 minutes of actually starting the rally and the speeches, and my phone going off, and I answer, and someone, a friend of mine who's traveled down from Newcastle, saying, when are we going to move from Embankment? They were still standing all the way back in Embankment, thinking that the march hadn't moved on.
Some people never actually left the Embankment.
And
they had to go
there.
straight and get their coaches
Absolutely.
back.
It's something that, I mean, like I said, it's and you put it perfectly, Kate. I mean, it is about unity in terms of cause and objective. But at the same time, holding that element of diversity and difference and the such.
I thought the size of it was actually a vindication of MAB, because I remember in one of the discussions we'd had that there had been something called a Million Man March in Washington, I think in the Afro-American community there, and we said we should have a 1 million man march here. Now, I must admit, we were all thinking, well, that's a bit a bit daft.
Yeah, don't get ahead of yourselves.
We'll never get that. That's unrealistic. And if you allow for the fact that we had 1 million women as well, then the 1 million man march and the 1 million woman march made the 2 million march. But it was Mab's
that was your
optimism.
vision.
Yeah,
Your
and in
vision.
your book, Stop the War, in your book, you mentioned that particular. It's, I mean, we can spend hours talking about our collective memories, and I have many. And you're absolutely right in saying that. I mean, one of the reasons why we managed to get those numbers was that in the months preceding, since we agreed with our allies across the world that the 15th of February 2003 would be a day of global protest against the coming war. We started this intense marathon, I would call it, of meetings up and down the country. I went to towns that I'd never been to. I went to village halls and spoke to, 20 or 30 people, and went to university campuses where I spoke to up to about 600 or 700 people. Day after day after day after day. And the stories that would come, with all of that are absolutely incredible. The people that have never, how many people approached us and said, we've never marched in our entire lives. We've never demonstrated for anything in our time. But for this, we feel so driven that we're bringing our neighbors, we're bringing our, children and grandchildren, and we're all going to be in London that day. It was
for hundreds of thousands. It was their first march.
Yeah, and lots of parts of the country you couldn't get a coach for any other purpose on that day because they were all booked to come to London.
I was part of a negotiation committee with MAB with I can't remember the train company to charter a train all the way down from Glasgow to London for the march, and that was sold out. That was absolutely packed. But and with all those, the war did go ahead. The war did happen, and I have to say that I was very, very. I don't know, depressed, downtrodden, a little bit. I don't know. It felt like, did we achieve anything? Did we achieve anything, Andrew?
Well, I think we did, but I mean, like you, perhaps I was always rather sceptical that we would succeed in stopping the war. I mean, and bear in mind, in Britain, we were trying to stop British participation, to stop the war altogether. That would have required something in America.
I mean, because let's not forget, France and Germany couldn't stop the war.
And America, the United States would have gone ahead with the war,
they
even
were
without
hell-bent,
Britain.
absolutely.
Donald Rumsfeld made that plain. Said if the British want to drop out, we understand. We'll go ahead anyway. So I thought it was always going to go ahead. And I remember when Andrew Bergin, who was then the Stop the War Coalition's press officer, rang at I think 2:00 in the morning to say that the war has started. And I had a sort of, that was a sort of like a blow to the gut at the time, even though we'd anticipated it. Now, as to whether it made a difference, I think there are a number of ways in which it did. And one obvious one was when the British government under Cameron wanted to bomb Syria in 2013. I think it was the legacy of the mass movement against the war in Iraq that led the Labour Party under Ed Miliband to oppose that, and as a result, that bombing didn't happen, and Obama aborted his own because he hadn't got British support in large part. That was an example of how the war, the movement against the war, had resonated. Having said that, I think that the greater resonance of the whole episode is the disaster that the war proved to be, and the disaster that the war in Afghanistan proved to be, and the calamity that was visited on Libya. I think finally there is a reluctance to engage in those sort of direct wars of intervention, and certainly in part because of the movement. As well as the fact that they've all had dreadful consequences and nothing positive to be said for any of them. But I do remember some little time later when we continued to hold large demonstrations, not on the scale of the 2003 February demonstration, we used to get messages from people in Iraq saying that they drew strength from seeing that people in Britain, in the sort of belly of the imperialist beast, were still demonstrating in such numbers. And that really, personally, I don't need any more vindication than that.
You're right. I think that, firstly, the possibility of these organizations, the three platforms coming together, I think that in itself changed the perception as to how right and left is defined, how ultimately when there is a cause that people, even of varying positions on the ideological spectrum, can come together and can work together and can share ideas, ideals even, and objectives. I think that was a mark that remains until now. And it's something that at the time, I remember there being several columns written about this marriage of convenience, about this being some sort of coming together that was going to dissipate and going to disappear in the very near future. And the fact that people can allay their differences and work together is something that drew inspiration for many, not only in the UK, but like you said, around the world. Since then, I was contacted by movements in Latin America, even in North America, in Canada, across Europe, in Southern Africa and the such, where they want to hear the story of how this became, of how you came together, of how you worked together. I remember being in South Africa around 2005, and I was invited by an elder figure within the community for dinner. And it was a lavish spread, but there was something like 40 or 50 people from amongst his own family, his own children and grandchildren, but also from the neighborhood. And he welcomed me and he said, you have to tell us about the 2 Million March. And South Africa had just recently emerged from apartheid and had, built this new South Africa. And, there was a lot of energy. And this elder gentleman, he said, what I don't get? How was it possible to work and collaborate and achieve such great heights with the white man? And everyone burst out laughing because they said, that's, our dad, that's how he talks, that's how. And I said, listen, I totally understand because, the memories are fresh in his mind. But that sort of, I think, is one of the biggest wins. And also something quite important. 20 years where Iraq has been absolutely decimated. Afghanistan left in shreds. The entire region probably of the Middle East made far worse, far more dangerous than it ever was. The thing is that people, through the lens of the 2 Million March, realized that the people and their government are not one. That Tony Blair did not act on behalf of or the instructions of the British people.
That's why one of the slogans, not in our name, had such resonance.
And that's one of the other outcomes, of course, of the demonstration and of the anti-war movement's campaigning. Tony Blair's career was pretty much over. I mean, he held on for a few years, but that was the end of it. He was completely damaged goods because he'd revealed himself in all his dishonesty to the British population, and even after he'd gone, I think when he was producing books and things like that, and it was impossible for him to go and have a normal book launch, and when he went to do events and so on, there'd be people out there protesting. And of course there were a number of inquiries into what happened in Iraq, so there were those attempts to hold the government accountable, and but he did pay the price.
You're absolutely right. I mean, mentioning this, two things come to mind. The first is a friend of mine who used to work at the BBC. He told me that Tony Blair, whenever coming onto any of the shows, would set a condition: don't talk about Iraq. You don't mention Iraq. That's my condition. That's my only condition, actually. And the second thing is, and this was brought up by an Egyptian friend of mine, where we shared a platform somewhere in Europe, I can't remember. And I remember him saying, in any other circumstance, in any other incident, across history even, Tony Blair and George W. Bush are regarded as political leaders who won wars. They actually were victorious in wars. In any other phase of history, they should have their statues in front of, in public squares or the such. But actually, they are going around making a condition upon people: never ask us about Iraq, never mention Iraq, don't ever bring Iraq to the table.
I just realised, I wasn't aware of it previously. I read a few days ago that the US Army had produced their own official history of the Iraq War, where they describe it as a strategic defeat. And so that's, which is quite an admission, really. I mean, Afghanistan, you don't need to wait for any official history, likewise. But I would just like, if I could just go back, Kate was absolutely right earlier when she talked about the diversity of the movement, the unity in diversity. And I think in sort of focusing on that, one has to think about what was new, because elements of that movement were familiar, I think, to us. CND, left-wing organisations, trade unions, and so on. But the new elements, the most important for me, was the alliance with the Muslim community. Absolutely, there were others that were very important. The school students walking out of school, and
military families,
the military families came a bit later. But yes, they were unprecedented too. Not huge in number, but vast in resonance and impact. And again, unprecedented, at least unprecedented since Britain moved to a volunteer army. But the Muslim community was absolutely preeminent. I don't think, you would know better, Anas, but I don't think there's ever been such an engagement by the mass of Muslims in Britain in any political campaign, or indeed in the life of Britain, ever since there has been a large Muslim community in Britain, which is the last 60 years, 70 years or so. And that was the most inspiring thing, because I'd obviously worked with Muslim or Muslim heritage people before in trade unions and anti-racist campaigns particularly, but those only scratched the surface of the community, and this was something, and I think this terrified the establishment in our country more than any other aspect, as a militant, organised, active, engaged Muslim community working alongside secular left-wingers. For a government or an establishment that is always engaged in interventions in Muslim countries around the world, that was pretty terrifying. And they spared no efforts to try and unpick that alliance and basically to get the Muslim community back into its box.
You're absolutely right. And, I recall how we would have mosques that would be the central hubs for gathering and signing petitions and
filling coaches
and doing the banners and the posters, from cities up and down the country. And that is unprecedented, because one of the main complaints you will find of Muslims in the country is we could never get our mosques to be engaged in anything that is relevant to us, in anything political, in anything, it's unfortunate that most mosques are of that type where it's just, passing on time and just doing the necessity and then just doing nothing whatsoever. That time was absolutely extraordinary. I used to go to some mosques and find it extremely difficult to get them to do something beyond the belief in the cause. So we talk about Iraq. Oh yes, that's very sad. So will you come join the? Oh, that's a step too far. But at that time, there was a totally different mood. There was a totally different kind of take on things, and people were totally committed to actually doing something.
And what empowered that, Anas?
I think the cause, definitely, but also because there was something new. And I once again go back to the alliance that was created. And whilst that, don't get me wrong, we got a lot of flack because we were sort of standing side to side and shoulder to shoulder with non-Muslims and socialists and leftists and the such. But the vast majority saw that as an incredible feat and saw that as an opportunity that shouldn't be missed.
Well, it was learning on both sides, I think, because
because your members as well. I mean, I'm sure they were flabbergasted.
Well, there were obviously a lot of sort of quite estranged from any mixing of religion and politics, or engaging with people with strong religious beliefs. And so there's an element of that. I mean, it wasn't, I would say, a significant element, but it had to be dealt with. So the fact that, there's a religious body of opinion here. I mean, there always had been some Christians, particularly involved in CND, but not on a sort of
very much so.
Not probably on the mass level. So that was on the one side. And I remember years ago doing an interview with our friend Azam Tamimi. He told me he was still puzzling over the fact he was sitting opposite a communist, because he'd been brought up that communists were completely the enemy, as atheistic and Marxist and so on. And here he was. I imagine for him it was a bit of a struggle, and probably other people in the Muslim community too. But if you have a cause that you get over, it felt to me like it was a landmark in a way, because Muslims in Britain are mainly an immigrant community, or where they're now obviously second or third generation. And often communities like that feel they have to keep the head down, just get on with life, and almost not draw any more attention to yourself than you need to, just to get by in a society that's not necessarily particularly welcoming. But I think that this was like something, here we are, we're fully part of this society. We are standing up too, because we share this, and that I thought was very inspiring.
And what about working with women? Because of course there were many women leaders in the anti-war movement, but of course you had great women leaders as well from your community.
Absolutely.
Salma Yaqub, for example.
That's opened, I think, that's opened the floodgates, literally, for more and more women, the likes of Selma. Remember how many Muslim women we had on stage come and speak, and on the various demonstrations, and often in their hijab, and absolutely proud of who they were and what they represented as such, and expressing themselves, talking on behalf of their community, and also showing pride in the fact that we're standing all together with our friends from across the board. I recall Kate from CND, our late friend Bruce Kent, a great man. Seriously, one of the, a giant of the movement, and he was my very first contact with CND, and he passed away a couple of years ago, but I mean he remains a huge figure in our in our progress in all of this that we're talking about.
Yeah, he was one of the best expressions of the kind of committed religious perspective from within
a man
CND.
of the cloth. I mean,
yes, a former
someone
Monsignor
who believed in ideals that were absolutely magnificent, and his take on this diversity was always glowing.
Yes, I mean he came from the church in Finsbury Park, and he was always telling people, how many different communities and languages, dozens of languages spoken within the church itself, and he really valued and celebrated that, and was so enthusiastic about the breadth of the movement. And I remember going with him to speak at a public meeting in a mosque in East London, which was really powerful event.
I had imagined.
It was amazing. Yeah.
And from your side, I mean, you can't mention the 2 million mark. You can't mention that particular campaign without mentioning people like Tony Benn.
Tony Benn, certainly, I mean, who had already a huge record on the left, and who actually left Parliament in 2001 saying he wanted to spend more time doing politics. And then immediately got pitched into the anti-war movement and became the president. He was an iconic figure. Of course, also, I mean, has that 2003 George Galloway had that status too. I mean, what's happened since is another story. But at that time, his resonance with different sections of the movement was immense. And the two of them, Tony Benn and George Galloway, and Jeremy Corbyn,
of course,
sort of represented.
And let's not forget Ken Livingstone.
And Ken Livingstone.
Yeah, as Mayor of London.
The Mayor of London.
Yeah.
I mean, he opened so many doors for us.
Very helpful, and they represented the sort of Labour left element. And it's worth just making a contemporary point. that those sort of voices would now be absolutely excluded from the Labour Party, absolutely excluded by the
And
president.
some of them are.
Silenced.
Even Tony Blair never even raised the idea of expelling Jeremy Corbyn or Tony Benn. He did actually expel George Galloway, but he didn't go wider than that. Was now we have this absolute regime of silence on foreign policy issues. And of course, it particularly affects, in just this last week in Parliament, a Labour MP was forced to withdraw for describing Palestine as an apartheid state, or Israel as an apartheid state.
Quoting Amnesty International.
Quoting Amnesty International. They could have been quoting Human Rights Watch, and they could have been quoting various Israeli organisations.
But Slim and such.
Because I think that was another, I mean, the march we're talking about is remembered rightly as a march against the Iraq War, but it also had a slogan of justice for Palestine. And I think that helped a lot in engaging Muslim community as well, because it feels the issue of Palestine very deeply, not exclusively Muslims, but that are the main backbone of opinion on that. And now such opinions are being,
totally
entirely marginalised in
Absolutely.
mainstream politics.
Absolutely. And, since then, obviously, as you put it, I mean, the Iraq experiment, as someone laughably put it, proved to be an utter failure, utter devastation, an utter tragedy. We're talking about several generations of Iraqis paying the price of what was essentially a lie and an illegal invasion and occupation of the country. We had an inquiry. We had an inquiry, trying to find out what happened, why, and probably in some of our minds, holding some people to account. So we had the Chilcot inquiry, which took something like 5 years over it should have done, and a budget which quadrupled.
It's like building HS2, the Chilcot inquiry is years late and massive over budget.
And then, where are we? We have the Chilcot inquiry now.
Well, I think part of the problem was, they found out and published extremely valuable and accurate information. But of course, the intention all along was to find out information, but not to hold anyone accountable, so that there would be no legal proceedings resulting from it.
Am I right in thinking or hearing somewhere, and I can't recall where, that Tony Blair's condition to the inquiry, that he would engage only if it held no one to account?
That's my understanding.
Well, yeah, I think the inquiry...
Because it was damning. If you read the sections that pertain to Tony Blair and the process in which this went through, it's fairly damning.
Yeah, it's clear who was guilty, but there were no legal follow-up.
If Tony Blair was to apply for any job right now, with that sort of description of him and his actions, he would never have any hope whatsoever of getting employment.
Well, he does look very haunted now, Tony Blair, when he appears in public, which I think is what he deserves. But Kate's right. It was a very damning inquiry, but I think it dodged two issues. One explicitly, which is said we're not going to rule on the legality of the war. Everyone knows it was illegal. They somehow bludgeoned the Attorney General of the time into producing a second opinion that it was legal, but no one believes that. But they dodged that. And the question of whether Tony Blair was actually deliberately dishonest. It said that mistakes were made and so on, and it's clear, of course, that the reason for going to war, Iraq's possession of weapons of mass destruction, was false. But they didn't actually say that he was deliberately dishonest, which he was, absolutely. Maybe he did believe there were weapons of mass destruction, that's possible, but he decided to go to war anyway. He'd pledged that to George Bush in March the preceding year, March 2002. And that, it was sort of dodged, but everyone can draw their own conclusions. And it's worth also recalling that a journalist talking to me about the Corbyn years a little while ago, where I'd worked for Jeremy Corbyn, said, what was your proudest moment of the time? Well, my proudest moment was on the day the Chilcot report was published. Jeremy Corbyn, on behalf of the Labour Party, apologised, first of all, to the Iraqi people, also to the British people, that the Labour Party had been the instrument of this war which had such dreadful consequences and was done on the basis of falsehoods. And that needs to be recalled as well. If Jeremy Corbyn, as leader of the Labour Party, had done nothing else, that would be enough.
And also never letting Tony Blair off the hook. I don't know if you remember the time he said Britain must pay the blood price, for the special relationship, so-called, with the United States. But he didn't pay it. His children weren't sent off to fight and pay the blood price, but it was the service people here and, of course, the people in Iraq who paid that blood price. That level of disastrous hypocrisy and kind of grandiose notions about Britain as well. I mean, it's shocking. It remains deeply shocking and unforgivable.
And thinking back, the whole context of the time, at the height of the newly introduced war on terror, we had Afghanistan in 2001, which saw the birth of Stop the War Coalition, and in 2003 the invasion and war in Iraq, and both in sort of retribution for 9/11, which had nothing to do with either. I mean, it's staggering. If I sometimes think that, let's say 50 years from now, if people, our grandchildren start reading about the history of the beginning of the 2000s, and they find this particular story, it would be not, almost sci-fi. It would almost be fairy tales. I mean, it would be absolutely unbelievable what happened. But it was allowed to happen.
Well, the Americans were determined to bring about regime change in Iraq, weren't they? And they just thought, right, this is the opportunity. Let's try and hang it on that, however many lies were necessary to do that. And they hung it on that and went to war on that basis. But as you say, it was so clear, such a transparent lie, and complete framing up of that the country, really. No wonder there was enormous international opposition. And just going back to the demonstration and so on, having that, on two levels, the international impact. One, all these demonstrations, tens of millions of people on that very same day, but also the level of international speakers that we actually had coming to London. Not only Jesse Jackson, but President Ben Bella, former president.
And he said "Vive la France" on that day.
I mean, what great figures,
because France wasn't, who had fought against all his life, was not.
France's position was admirable at the time, and its opposition was very, very clear. And they had this magnificent foreign secretary who challenged our own Jack Straw at the time and challenged Colin Powell at the UN Security Council. We also had the former head of the UN inspection team,
Scott Ritter.
Scott Ritter.
Yeah.
Scott Ritter.
Yeah.
He also was fantastic when he spoke.
We had tremendous speakers.
Didn't we have what's his name? That actor from. The tall guy.
Oh, Tim Robbins.
Tim Robbins. We had Tim Robbins. We had Miss Dynamite.
Oh, wasn't she fantastic?
We had Tim Robbins on the stage.
Well, he didn't speak.
Because that was my fault. Because I'm not really very good on films in Hollywood, but we had this.
He probably didn't know who he was.
I didn't. That's a problem. And we had a very strict. We had a vast number of people wanted to speak, far more than could be accommodated. We had a strict time limit. It was like 3 minutes each, and we had everyone, and there wasn't any negotiation. Vanessa Redgrave, who I do know who she was, she turned up and wanted to speak, but we said no. And then I was told Tim Robbins was there, and he wanted. I said, "He's not on the list. He can't speak."
My God, an A-lister, Hollywood A-lister.
I know, but
Andrew, how could you?
He then stood next to Jesse Jackson while Jesse Jackson spoke, so he was in the frame. But yeah, it was a cultural faux pas.
It was fantastic. It was absolutely fantastic. I mean, at the time, if you recall, none of the political, even the Conservatives, for instance, on the opposition, who voted for the war, they had. I don't think they had any representatives, but we had the leader of the Lib Dems. We had Charles Kennedy, whom I introduced. And I remember, you know how it works, because we alternate as chairs, and we are each allocated a particular speaker. So I was allocated Charles Kennedy. So I went to him just before, and I said, firstly, thank you very much for coming today. And so I'm going to introduce you as Charles Kennedy, leader of the Lib Dem. And he said, no, I'm Charles Kennedy, and I'm here to speak on behalf of myself. in my personal capacity, which was, I have to say, I was a little bit disappointed. I wanted to do a trick and to sort of say that, but in any case, I mean, he spoke fairly well, and his position thereafter was quite positive in regards with what happened. So yeah, I mean, the stage was full of luminaries from across the board.
Yeah, and the other thing that really helped mobilise for the day, of course, was the fact that eventually all the mainstream newspapers started to publish the route of the march and all the details in their pages. And of course, the Daily Mirror produced their own anti-war placard.
Absolutely.
I mean, imagine that.
The Daily Mirror provided the big screens that were in Hyde Park and the such. It was Piers Morgan.
For me, Piers Morgan's always had a lot of credit in the bank.
Yes.
I mean, it's another one, I wouldn't want to endorse everything that he's said and done since, but that is to his loss.
Absolutely.
He was
Daily...
a young editor in a position of influence. Very easy to have gone along with a Labour government for the Mirror. That's always a Labour paper. But he took a stand. And
No, the Daily Mirror sponsored the big screens. It's, as you put it, it's published a takeout, but where the route was outlined and everything. And I recall the very next day, I was basically too tired. I lived in Leeds at the time, and I was just too tired to travel back up at the end of the day. So I stayed in a nearby B&B, and I recall I was like really out of it. I was totally really tired, and plus, one thing that we forget, how cold it was that day. By the way, I mean, this is to the credit of the 2 million people who came out. It was freezing. It was absolutely freezing. Yet people, just basically filled central London like they did. But the very next day, it's around 5:30, 6 a.m. Someone calls, and I'm sort of, disturbed from my sleep. And I look at the phone, who is this person? And I answer, and he says, Ennis, what are you doing right now? Please go and have a look at the nearest newsstand, newsagent. And I was thinking, what's going on? And half asleep, I put on my clothes, my coat, and I walked to the corner shop. And in front of me was a sight I will never forget. A newsstand, with all the papers, and every single paper had the front page fully, absolutely the whole front page fully dedicated to the march. It was just, it made me go absolutely warm and fuzzy.
It was an achievement. It was an achievement.
It was an incredible achievement.
And no one who went on that march has had any cause for regret
Not
since.
At all. No one has said, oh, I wish I wasn't there. In fact, I would go even further. In subsequent weeks, months, in public meetings that we held, I came across countless, dozens probably, of MPs from all parties who would, I would sit with and have a debate with, or an argument with, and the such, but who would confess either publicly or afterwards that I was actually there. I was on the march. And it was absolutely, at one time, it made the audience burst out in laughter, because that same MP had voted clearly for the war, but said, by the way, I took my mum and we were there and we were with everyone.
Yeah, we changed minds.
It was the popular thing to do.
I know. It was like you couldn't find any young person in 60s America who wasn't at Woodstock. Everyone claimed to be there. Everyone claimed to be there. But the one group of people that were not on the march, because they were not allowed to be, were BBC journalists. Remember, they were instructed by the corporation, something that had never been done before, nor since, as far as I know, that they were not allowed to attend the march because it would prejudice the corporation's impartiality. So the only BBC journalists there were ones actually working, reporting on it. But it shows how rattled the government was.
I didn't know that. That's shocking.
It was an extraordinary thing. No, they were told they could not go on the march. There'd been a very big march, not nearly as big, but substantial, of the Countryside Alliance against
just a week before. Well, no. It was in September of the previous year.
It's a week before the September 2000
correct.
demonstration. And no such edict had been issued then. And in fact, although the Countryside Alliance had been marching against Labour government policy, Tony Blair wrote a very nice letter to the organisers of the march, thanking them for their behaviour and so on and so forth. But with this march, it was regarded as a threat, and so big a threat that off-duty BBC journalists could not attend at risk of losing their job.
But do you remember how the establishment tried to prevent us going into Hyde Park because of the grass? Right. You know, that was the only venue big enough for all those people, and they tried to stop us using that park.
I remember that, because I remember, I can't remember if either of you were there, but I certainly went with other people from Stop the War to meet the Metropolitan Police and the Hyde Park Police in a little hut in the middle of Hyde Park.
Yes, I was there.
Where they and they all convened very solemnly, looking at us and saying, "Well, you know, you've been told by Tessa Jowell, the Secretary of State, you can't enter the park because you might damage the grass. We would like to invite you to consider how you will disperse the march at the entrance to Hyde Park." And I remember saying that I'd like you to consider how you were going to stop more than 1 million people, which is what we were estimating at the time, from entering Hyde Park under those circumstances. And they called an adjournment, and the police went upstairs, and they came back down and said, "Right, fine, okay, you're going to go into the park. We'll just discuss, you know, how we organise all of that." And it shows, and it's worth remembering when we have at the moment a government introducing more and more authoritarian legislation against the right to strike, the right to protest, and all of this, that if you've got enough numbers, there's not much they can do.
No, and to face them down.
Yeah. And by the way, I mean, since we talked about Daily Mirror, we talked about the newsstands full of the pictures of the march, and we talked about the BBC, I think it's appropriate that we talk a little bit about the media. Because I don't know, I mean, is it right to say that the standards have gone down? Is it right to say that the media has... I mean, in terms of its coverage, definitely it's problematic. I'd say, I mean, to be kind, to be very, very kind.
There seems to be a limit on the voices of opposition that they will include in their discussions. I mean, I was talking with our colleague Lindsay German from Stop the War about this the other day. We used to regularly be invited onto quite high level and important programmes to comment and put the alternative perspective on peace. Now virtually nothing.
No one calls.
I know. It's as if they've been instructed. Not saying they have been, Anas. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. But, you know, it's a very, very noticeable
it's something
change.
that we've all noticed. I mean, I speak to my friends and I ask them, I say, how often are you invited to Sky or the BBC or ITV or such? And most likely the answer is never.
No, I mean, we did get invited on a lot around the time of the march, but there still was this huge bias towards the government. I wouldn't say standards are lower now than they were then. They were low then. I mean, one difference now is social media has exploded since that wasn't really the case in 2003. But I remember I was being followed around, but by my agreement, obviously, by a BBC crew who wanted to make a piece about the anti-war movement for weeks, not every day, but they've been to several events I've been at, interviewing me on each time for a programme about the anti-war movement. And when the programme appeared, I was in it, but it was very limited and
fleetingly,
and there were a lot of stuff about pro-war voices from Jack Straw's constituency Labour Party and so on. And this was quite different to the programme that had been... So I rang the journalist, who I knew quite well. I can't remember his name now, very tall bloke. Anyway, and I said, "Oh, what's happened?" And he said, the BBC hierarchy said, you know, at the last minute, we just had to change it. We couldn't do something that was just about the anti-war movement, that had got 2 million people out on the streets. They had to balance it. And this was Alistair Campbell, an unremitting pressure from the Labour Party on the media, and the media just capitulates. Which is why now, I mean, I find it hard to rally to the BBC's defence when it's under attack by the right wing now, as a sort of extension of the culture wars, because you know they do the bidding of government at the expense of the journalistic mission.
It's quite sad. It's quite sad. I mean, there was a time, I recall. I don't know whether I was naive, but there was a time I recall when the BBC was sort of the emblem, the sort of icon of British, British culture, British society, and the such. Everyone was trying, how do we get the programs that are on the BBC? How do we? I think that the big events expose realities, and we found out then, and we find out more now that the BBC's role, its performance, its so-called impartiality is not really as one would desire.
No, well, on the left, we'd known all this from its reporting on industrial disputes for years, where it was always, bent in favour of the employers or the government, but it brought it home to a far wider number of people.